Good day to all matriculants of 2020. This is Mr. P Ngudle, Subject Advisor for Life Sciences at OR Tambo Coastal District in the Eastern Cape. We are going to look at reflex action, central nervous system disorders, which you know, examples being Alzheimer and multiple sclerosis. The next topic that will be touched is stem cell use and how to treat injuries. Right, as we know, we have to follow the examination guidelines. Now, the examination guidelines in this subtopic states that each learner needs to know the definition of reflex action and a reflex arc. We'll also have to look at the structure of a reflex arc and functions of each part using a diagram. So you need to know a receptor, you need to know all those labels: sensory neuron, dorsal, root of spinal nerve, spinal cord, interneuron, motor neuron, ventral root of spinal nerve, and the effector. Next will be the functioning of a simple reflex action using an example. We will also look at how important is a reflex action. In other words, the significance of a reflex action. The last in this part will be significance of synapses. Significance of synapses. Now, you all know the importance of biological terms in each topic. For you to master each topic, you need to know all the biological terms that are associated with that topic. Some books are calling them terminology. So it is terminology or just biological terms. Now, for this one particularly, you need to know how you need to define reflex action, reflex arc, receptor, effector, synapse, motor neuron, sensory neuron, connector neuron, impulse, stimulus, central nervous system. And of course, according to the examination guidelines, you need to separate between reflex action and reflex arc. Now, learners, reflex action is called a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. It's a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. A stimulus is any change that occurs in both the internal and external environment. So, and for every stimulus, there has to be a response. So we are saying reflex action is a quick automatic response to a stimulus. But a reflex arc, it's a path taken by an impulse in bringing about a response to a stimulus during a reflex action. It is a direction, it's a path taken by an impulse from receptors to effectors. Of course, in between receptors and effectors, there's central nervous system, particularly the spinal cord. So simply put, you can say a reflex arc is a path taken by an impulse from receptors to the effectors. Instead of, if you like, you can say it is a path taken by an impulse in bringing about a response to a stimulus during a reflex action. Now, this is what happens when a finger is bent. As you can see in the example here, a stimulus is generated and it is converted into an impulse. And that impulse now moves along the sensory neuron on the dorsal nerve root, as you can see there. Then it goes into the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord through the connector neuron, and then the message now comes back with the motor neurons into the muscle, which is an effector. So this is how a reflex arc, represents. In fact, this is how reflex action takes place. Again, learners, as you have seen in the diagram that we just studied in this preceding slide, how the reflex action is interpreted, how reflex arc works, functioning of a simple reflex action. And we have an example. Fortunately, I've seen a drawing of a human being with his finger being bent, perhaps by candlelight. So the finger is bending there. And then how is the reflex arc protecting this human being? So this is how reflex action works. It says, especially if we are using our example there, the heat receptors in the skin of the fingers of that person, they received heat stimulus, and the stimulus was then converted into a nerve impulse. Then the sensory neuron conducts now that impulse through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve into the spinal cord. Then in the spinal cord, the sensory neuron makes some contact. We call it synaptic contact with a connector neuron, which is there in the spinal cord. You can see something that looks like an H, a letter H. That should be your gray matter. That is where you find your connector neurons. Now, the sensory neuron makes a synaptic contact with a connector neuron, and it makes also with the motor neuron. So you can see the direction. From the receptor, you've got the sensory neuron along the dorsal root of the nerve, going into the spinal cord, making a synaptic contact with the connector neuron in the spinal cord, the connector neuron making a synaptic contact with the motor neuron that must come out of the spinal cord now, right into the effectors. Then the impulse is conducted by the motor neuron out of the spinal cord towards the muscles of the hand, which act as effectors. Remember, the hand must be removed now. Why? Because a response has been produced from the central nervous system. Remember, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. But of course, it is also important to note that during a reflex action, the brain is not essentially involved. It is the spinal cord that is involved. So what is important, when the impulse leaves now the spinal cord, it is conducted by the motor neuron right into the effectors. Then the effectors, the examples of effectors, in this case, in this particular case, it is the muscles in the hand, in the fingers of that person. So the muscles will contract now and pull their hand and pull the hand of the person away from the hot surface. This is how a reflex action works. Now, why is reflex action important? We are looking at significance of a reflex action. Number one, it is fast. Please, you need to note that, matriculants. It is fast, and why is it fast? Because the nerve impulse does not have to travel to the brain for interpretation. Remember earlier on I said the brain is not practically involved. Of course, the brain and the spinal cord, that's your central nervous system. So reflex action is important because it is fast. And then we're saying connector neuron makes a shortcut possible. A shortcut possible. Remember we're saying we're talking about here, as we defined earlier on, we said reflex action is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. That is what is key when it comes to reflex action. It has to be a rapid, a quick process. So number three, we're saying reflex arc protects the body from harm because part of the body that is affected is removed more quickly from what is injuring it. Can I say that again now? In summary, in 3 points, we're saying how significant is the reflex action? It is fast because the nerve impulse does not have to travel to the brain for interpretation. Number two, the connector neuron makes a shortcut possible. Number three, we're saying reflex arc protects the body from harm because part of the body that is affected is removed more quickly from whatever source of injury. Next is the significance of synapses. Remember, a synapse is a microscopic gap between neurons. So synapses are microscopic gaps between neurons. That's how you define synapses. Now, in the synapses, chemicals are produced which are called neurotransmitters. And then it is these neurotransmitters that are released that allow an impulse to pass from one neuron to another. And synapses act as valves that ensure that impulses can move in one direction only. So an impulse must move in one direction. So that's how synapses are important. So that is a significance of a synapse. Now, guys, Alzheimer's disease is a degenerative disease of the brain, which causes the loss of memory and thinking skills. So what is important for you to note here? Two keywords is degeneration of some parts of the brain. There's also loss of memory. So that should characterize Alzheimer's. So whenever you hear of degeneration of the brain and the loss of memory, think of Alzheimer's. It occurs when the tissue within the brain wastes away, usually in older persons. And the people with this disease, they display symptoms of, as I've said, memory loss, and also the change in the way they're thinking. So you can simply say confusion also sets in. So that is all about Alzheimer's disease. Remember, according to the examination guidelines, you need to know the causes of the disease as well as the symptoms. So you don't have to worry much about how to treat it. The second disorder that is associated with the central nervous system is multiple sclerosis. And then this one occurs when the body's immune system attacks and destroys the myelin sheath. You know, the myelin sheath, if you know the structure of the motor neuron, you know, around the axon, one of the tissues or layers that surround the axon. Now, the immune system begins to destroy that part of the a neuron or motor neuron. Let me not say motor neuron, by the way. All neurons should have myelin sheath. And then now when the immune system attacks and destroys myelin sheath, the condition that results is the multiple sclerosis. So then what are the symptoms? So the affected persons will show physical and mental disabilities. Physical and mental disabilities is also a symptom in the multiple sclerosis. Remember in Alzheimer, we talked about memory loss, even here in this case, but it's not memory loss here. We should separate the two. It's just mental disability. So perhaps the brain is not functioning well. So that is all about multiple sclerosis. Guys, the next topic is stem cell research. Here we're going to look at what are stem cells and where can we find them? Where are they harvested? And of course, why are they important? What is the use? What are the uses of stem cells? So we're saying stem cells are undifferentiated cells that have a potential to differentiate to form any tissue or organ in the body. That is a stem cell. They can form any tissue, any organ in the body. And then where are they found? There's different sources of stem cells. There's what is called embryonic stem cells, adult stem cells from the cord blood. Now, embryonic stem cells are those that are taken from human embryos, more particularly from the blastocysts, you know, where an embryo is between 4 to 5 days of age. And then that is where embryonic stem cells are harvested. And now when they are harvested, then the embryos are then destroyed in the process. You need to note that. That is important. Now the adult stem cells are taken from, you know, the body tissues, one of the body tissues. And you've got now the stem cells from the cord, as the name suggests. You know, during birth, that the umbilical cord is cut and blood may come out. So stem cells from the cord blood are taken from the blood of the umbilical cord and the placenta. Stem cells can be used to treat diseases in couples that cannot have children. They can also be used to generate new cells to replace damaged or diseased tissues or organs. Now, learners, I'd like you now to look at this short activity that I've attached to this presentation. And it says, as you can see the diagram, it's a diagram of a reflex arc. You can see right on top left diagram, there's a finger there. It's a thumb. Underneath that, it's a candle, right? So there's some fire there. I think the finger, it's going to burn there. But at this stage, I hope and I believe that you are able to label all the parts of the reflex arc. Remember when we began the topic, I said terminology is very, very important. So this is the diagram that you are given, and it says there on top, the diagram below represents a pathway making possible a process occurring in humans. Study the diagram and answer the questions. And I'd like us to note that even before we touch on the questions, the question says, this diagram represents a pathway making possible a process. So the term pathway should remind you something. And also the pathway makes a process occurring in humans. that also should remind you about something. Next now is the set of questions based on the diagram. Now question number 1 says, which process is made possible by the pathway shown in the diagram? Remember, you have to, according to the examination guidelines, know the difference between reflex action and the reflex arc. So reflex action is the process. And the question here says, which process is represented, by the way, which process is made possible by the pathway shown in the diagram? So your answer there obviously should be reflex action. Now question number 2 says, identify the letter that represents, number A, a stimulus. So in your diagram there, what should be the stimulus there? What should be the stimulus? The letter that represents a stimulus. And you must be very careful when you answer examination questions. If they say the letter, your answer should not say the finger, or what shall I say, the candle. It should be A. So the answer there is A. And then now number 2B says, identify the letter that represents the effector. The effector should be F. So the correct answer there is F. Because remember, the examples of effectors are muscles and glands. Question number 3 says, give the name of the microscopic gap represented by the part labeled D. Labeled D, yeah, it's indicated there in the diagram in the spinal cord. You know, even by definition, and also part of the terminology, microscopic gap between neurons is a synapse. So your answer there is synapse. The last question here says, damage to which neuron, meaning B, C, or E, will cause, number 1, inability to respond. You have the diagram there. A B represents, you will agree with me, B should be the sensory neuron, because you can see it runs across the dorsal nerve root, and so that should be the sensory neuron there. And inability to respond, okay, let's understand our labels here. C is your connector neuron, and E, that should be your motor neuron. And by this time, I hope that you know the functions of the neurons. Now, which one will cause inability to respond if it is damaged between these neurons? Obviously, that should be what? A motor neuron. And in this case, in this diagram, our motor neuron is E. Then, number 2, which damage, okay, damage to which neuron will cause loss of sensation? Obviously, that should be what? Your sensory neuron, which is B. So the correct answer there is B. Please don't write sensory neuron, write B, because the question is about letters here. Then the last one, loss of both sensation and ability to respond. I'm sure you'll fairly run through those questions with ease if you study your diagrams and the functions of various parts of each diagram with ease.